the Jewish refusal movement. So he was a hero. He was eventually released under glasnost when the Soviet Union was starting to fall and crumble, and he was able to go to Israel. It was sort of an exchange of political prisoners, and he went to Israel, and it was a huge. The Jewish world was united, and in a very powerful way. And I don't think we've been so united since those days. It was the student struggle for Soviet Jewry. The students and basically housewives ran this human rights campaign to free Soviet Jews, and it was really a moment in which the Jewish diaspora community and the Israelis were very united, fighting for the rights. So he's coming here tomorrow evening, and it's the first time he's speaking for ISGAP, which is amazing, and it's a great from the perspective of fighting for human rights in general and fighting anti-Semitism specifically. It's really, for me, and I think for us, a tremendous honor that he's coming here. And he went on to Israel, and he became a minister in various governments, and became a real leader in Israel. So he's an interesting and important character. So I'll introduce him formally tomorrow, but you can even Google him and see who he is. So that's tomorrow evening, so it's special. And not to take away or diminish from Professor Yossi Shain, it's very special that he's here as well. So we're going to change the order of events this afternoon. So basically, Yossi is going to do 2 plenary sessions this afternoon here in this room. And so we're going to have 90 minutes, then a tea break, and another 90 minutes with Yossi. And then tomorrow morning, Jonathan Spire, who I think is around, he's in the back, he's in the next aisle in the back. He will not be speaking this afternoon, but tomorrow he's going to do 2 sessions, one on Hezbollah and anti-Semitism. And because we put him on the spot, he graciously also agreed to, he'll take questions in the second session, but also speak in general what's going on in the Middle East in this moment. It's a very complex, changing, dynamic, multidimensional area to try to grapple with and to understand. And Jonathan is one of the leading analysts on the Middle East, and he has amazing scholarly and academic expertise, and he's also been on the ground in interesting places that most people don't go into, and I'm sure he'll draw on that experience too. So it will be a special morning tomorrow. So and thanks for Jonathan for being amenable to the change. Okay, so now we have Yossi. And sorry for the delay. Okay. So Yossi is going to speak on the Israeli century and the Israelization of anti-Semitism. And Yossi is a leading scholar. He's a professor of political science at Tel Aviv University, and he's also the chairman of the department of, political science, and he serves as the chairman of the political science department, and he's also the head of the Abba Eban Graduate Studies Program in Diplomacy, and he's the director of the Francis Brody Institute of Applied Diplomacy. He's also recently retired, but he was while he was a professor at Tel Aviv University, he was also a professor of comparative government and diaspora politics at Georgetown University in Washington, and he's the founding director and program of the Israelization program at Georgetown, which is a very important ongoing program. He has a BA in philosophy and an MA in political science from Tel Aviv University, and he did his PhD at Yale University. He's published many books and articles. He's taught and lectured around the world, and he's a real expert at many issues. His new book, which was just published in Hebrew, and it's going to be coming out in English, deals with Israel-American diaspora relations, which is a very important topic now in the Jewish world in the United States, in the United States in general, but the Jewish community specifically, in its relationship to Israel, and it's sort of the changing dynamics of Israel diaspora affairs. So it's really an honor to have an expert like Yossi to spend time with us. So Yossi.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you, Charles, and thank you for all the last-minute arrangement, and thank you for the flexibility, and thank you, Ira, for bearing me in the last months. I don't know where he is, but I'm privileged to be here. It's my third visit to this seminar, and each time when I come, especially since they put it on YouTube, I have to think what I'm going to say new. Otherwise, they're going to have me speaking 3 similar lectures in 3 years, which I don't think it's flattering at all. So I'm thinking constantly, especially in light also of the beautiful list that Charles put of speakers and subjects. What can I contribute to this discussion? What can I bring to the fore that stimulate your thinking about this issue, why this seminar is being held, and why these issues are so, I would say, permanent almost on the international scene and the intellectual scene. What makes this kind of like issue of anti-Semitism as a broad discussion, something which is never going away? Or, for that matter, if it doesn't go away, why it changes its face? How do we think about it? Why it appears or reappear or sometimes subsides in a different fashion? And to what extent it touches on many other issues that are so relevant to the way we think about modernity, to the way we think about race relations, to the way we think about religious relations, to the way we think about the liberal state, to the way we think about power and powerlessness. And as you will see from my lecture today, we are, in fact, dealing with a subject which touches on all of these corners in various ways, because the subject is in many ways fluid, even though it's permanent. It relates to what we call the idea of enmity or hate or let's say stigmatization or violence, whatever it is. But it has different faces in Jewish history and in the history of humanity, for that matter, especially the history of humanity as we have seen it in what we call the broad West. Not necessarily in the East, in terms of China or Japan or Korea, but in the West, broadly defined, including, of course, where the 3 major religious denominations have emerged: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In the West, in terms of like the way the West have reached places from Latin America to Africa to other places, to the question of the West in terms of its own regime, in terms of like the nature of democracy and liberalism, to the question of the position of individuals and groups amongst our modern states, in terms of minorities, individual rights, the question of victimhood, the question of race. All of the above are engulfing the question of anti-Semitism. And that is a very interesting point to make, because it means that in that respect, the Jewish issue, some would have called it in the 19th century the Jewish question, because in the 19th centuries they used to ask questions. Lots of questions were asked in search of an answer. There was supposed to be an answer. Of course, in the case of the Jews, they got the final solution eventually. There was a final answer among the Nazis. But this is not the case only. The big issue is, of course, why is it that this Jewish question is constantly following us in the ethos of the West from day one almost of, I would say, the Western culture, perhaps with some variation between the Greek culture and the Jewish culture, the culture of rationality and the culture of contemplation, 2 different cultures, as we know, that emerged in the West. This is a very interesting question because it touches a chord all the way to today's politics. You ask yourself, how can it be that this question is again so reverberating in the land of England? Why is it that this question continues to haunt the issue of the French identity? Why is it that it's constantly being interjected into the American reality? Why is it that it's constantly on the core issue in the relations between Muslims and the West? Why is it that this question is becoming even engulfed the question of South African apartheid. Why is it that this question of the Jews and anti-Semitism is constantly being interjected into the language, into the culture, into the discourse, what we want to call, in terms of its evolution? This is a fascinating question that touches on several other broader questions. The Jewish issue, or the Jewish issue as it comes to be known in terms of like the issue of the Jews in terms of anti-Semitism, which we will define in a second, is very much also deals with questions that are never-ending questions in our life. First of all, the question of power and powerlessness. It is not by mistake that the same issue of the Jews, which is anti-Semitism, suffering from powerlessness, now the anti-Semitism is related to the Jews as powerful. Interesting enough. It is not by mistake that the Jews who have been charged as being universal are oftentimes being charged of being sub-tribal and particular. It is not by mistake that the Jews who have been stigmatized for being at the outskirts of communities as reviled and poor have been accused as being too rich and greedy. It is not by mistake that the Jews who have been defined as being dispersed and diasporic are being defined by the overwhelming power of their sovereignty, and so on and so forth. This is a remarkable journey that touches on the issue of the Jews and Jewish hate or Jewish stigmatization or whatever as part of what we call the characteristic of humanity. And this is not by mistake, because indeed the Jewish case has been injected into humanity in a variety of manners that brings humanity itself and various civilizations and states and communities and ethnic groups to ask questions which are completely related to what we call issues that are surrounding the Jews. This has been the case since the collapse of the Judean kingdom in the 6th century BC and the walking of the Jews into Babylon. And we certainly can chronicle this issue, and we will see. And this, of course, continues to be today as we discuss the issue of Donald Trump and Congresswoman Omar. And the Jews are in between. And you ask yourself, what's going on here? And we discuss England and Corbyn, and we discuss the Jewish question. Even where there are no Jews anymore in that respect, or the Jews are not even relevant to society, the question still resonates. And the legacy still speaks loud. Some of these issues relate to reality, or to the depiction of reality, how reality is being presented to you, and some of which depend and also defined by mythology, by language. It is not by mistake that the language of apartheid has been appropriated from South Africa to the Middle East. Doesn't matter whether it was hijacked, but this is a language which is superimposed on certain realities. And the Jews are either the powerless people or the villain, both in that respect. That was really informs the Jewish question as it evolved. This question, of course, will take a twist in history in the last 70 years, because in the last 70 years, the issue of the powerful became very much related also to the emergence of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is by far the most incredible evolution of the Jewish people since perhaps the time of the First Temple in the Davidic kingdom, which we don't have lots of information about by biblical stories. And this is remarkable in a sense because we live in a time when for the first time in history, the vast majority of the Jews will soon reside in a sovereign state. This is quite a remarkable development, because from people who would define by diaspora, the big D, if you only look at the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences in 1932, and you look diaspora, and who wrote it? Samuel Dubnov. he mentioned only the Jews. The Jews who were defined by diaspora, which became now many Ds, including diversity and division and so on, and everybody has a diaspora, of course, nowadays. The Jews are now becoming more and more identified with statehood and sovereignty, their big S. And this is developing in a very interesting trajectory into the future, which we, of course, we don't know, but certainly the balance of power and powerlessness has been changing. Therefore, when there is an issue today about what we call old anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism, we basically divide it in two parts. One is the Jews without statehood, and the second is the Jews with statehood. One is reviling the Jews for whatever reason we will discuss, and the other is vis-a-vis the state of Israel. That, of course, confuses matters even more, especially since the Jewish people, notwithstanding the fact that the majority of whom will reside in a sovereign state, are still having a huge chunk of them, at least half right now, in the diaspora. That also confuses the diaspora. Which positions are we taking? A diasporic position of powerlessness or a sovereign position of powerfulness? The world is discussing it in the arena of power. The Jews are addressing it. Others are addressing it as well. And each and one of these groups, and many groups are addressing it, are taking positions which are constantly changing in terms of the legacy which they adopt. This has tremendous importance on questions such as citizenship, patriotism, the demarcation of boundaries of states, the demarcation of cultures, the relations of religion, the role of the liberal state and democracy, question of race, etc., etc., etc. To the point when one wonders to what extent we have exhausted this question, or whether we should give it new boundaries in terms of discussion. Because the big question, and the seminar being held here by Charles, is indeed a very important seminar, because it's clear to us that this issue and the designation of anti-Semitism is constantly with us. It is not by mistake that you have envoys coming and people of tremendous stature and Sharansky himself. Look at Sharansky. You will meet him tomorrow. Sharansky himself was informing by the issue of anti-Semitism the entire question of the Cold War. When Sharansky was released from the Soviet Union, after the Jackson-Winnick Amendment passed in 1974, and that took some time until he was released, 12 years later, he was more an American hero in terms of the legacy of freedom and the fight against the Soviet Union than an Israeli hero, undoubtedly in the beginning. So this question of the Jewish issue is certainly taking shapes in a variety of manners worldwide, and one has to address it in that perspective. It's not an easy one, because it requires one to understand history, relations in geopolitical manner, the nature of the modern state, the nature of the individual in modernity, the question of religion and its evolution, etc., etc. If I speak too quickly, it's because I have to keep my mind plugged. So let's begin by seeing how this all evolved. I will begin by taking you into a journey. In my last book, it was presented to you by Charles, but not what it says in the book, but rather he touched on one issue. The book which I wrote, called The Israeli Century in the Israeli Judaism, I wrote it in Hebrew, and it created a big stir in Israel, to my happiness, of course, where I make the point that we are in a different era of Jewish history, and this is the era of the Jewish century, or of the Israeli century, where everything Jewish in the world will be informed by what Israel does. Everything, I mean culture-wise, theological-wise, geopolitically, etc., etc. I also make the point that we are in a very interesting era, that there is no Jewish alternative responses to the Israeli century in terms of a model. In the past, there used to be many models. Model of Jewish autonomy, model of the Jewish Bund, for example, of socialist Jewish parties in the world, a model of Reform Judaism as a liberal part of the liberal creed, a model of emancipation and integration. Nowadays, if I ask you one question, and Charles can ask you, who is, one name you will give me, a Jewish role model in the world, you will not find one. Only the state of Israel you will find. One Jewish role model in the world, until now maybe we had one. Elie Wiesel was the last one, representing the Holocaust as someone, as an overarching phenomena. The very, very interesting question is therefore, how did it come about that the state of Israel has took over Judaism? Not over took over, it's not a hostile taking over, but kind of an evolutionary nature. And what does it do also to anti-Semitism? To what extent it's all related to state power and the Jewish case of Israel. This also relates to the very distinction between the way Israelis react to anti-Semitism and diaspora Jewry react to anti-Semitism. What they understand about it. Including geopolitics in France, in Britain, in the United States, Donald Trump, you name it. For Israelis, as I will suggest to you in the second part of my lecture, this is a completely different story. Israelis are not apologetic, are not at all thinking as victims. They're thinking as powerful, and they don't take it seriously, anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism for them is a disease of the diaspora. This is how it was created. Zionism was created, understanding, as Herzl put it and Pinsker put it, as the disease of the diasporic life, which means life without power. When you have life without power, you are subjected to all the whims of persecution, of disgrace, of living a life without any future, of what we call randomness, the life of chaos. Throughout history, Jews have lived the life of chaos. They used to wake up in the morning and they didn't know if the normality will prevail or chaos will take over overnight. They would be expelled from all over the world. They will be attacked in pogroms and all sorts of attacks all over the world, wherever they resided, notwithstanding their desire to be part and parcel of the societies in which they dwelled. The Israeli century is the century where the issue of lack of security is, in fact, being answered. It's not a full answer, but it's certainly a very big answer. We will not let it happen again. You will attack us, we'll attack you back, and usually we will attack you in such a severe manner that you will not think twice about attacking us again. This is quite a remarkable shift, and that also changed their mindset. From a time of people who feel subjected to randomality to the issue of arbitrariness, to the issue of stability and power. This is how it's being practiced, and this is also how we are also interpreting collective memory of the Jews. So anti-Semitism has tremendous to do with the interpretation of collective memory. All of this is superimposed or is being part and parcel of the countries and cultures in which the Jews dwell and shaped over the years. The Jews had tremendous amount of contribution to the shaping of the American legacy. Even the idea of the American melting pot was shaped by the Jews, whether you know it or not. You know who invented the word melting pot? Srulik Zangwill, an activist Zionist man who wrote a play in Broadway, and President Roosevelt stood and said, "Thank you, Mr. Zangwill, for creating America." Or Horace Kellan, for that matter. For looking at the universal, the Jews absolutely had a tremendous impact of the way France has been created in modernity. let alone Great Britain in which you dwell. It is not by mistake that Cromwell brought the Jews back here, understanding that Britain, as he envisioned it, has to be something like the old biblical decree. When he brought Ben Israel from Holland, from the Dutch, and Ben Israel is the #1 Jew for serving in rejuvenation, it was part and parcel of envisioning how the modern state will be created. It's not by mistake that the Jewish story will be so important for the creation of Westphalia in 1648. It is not by mistake that it will be so critical to the Congress of Vienna in 1815, etc., etc. Because the Jewish question, or the Jewish people, have informed this society from antiquity all the way to modernity, not always with the understanding what needs to be done. Once you understand this gravity of the question, you also understand why it never goes away, why it is the soft belly of the Jews, and why it's constantly being overplayed in the international arena. Let alone, of course, the calamity that befell the Jews in history, and above all in the Holocaust. The mega kind of historical disaster that befell the Jewish people and humanity itself. Now, what do we make of it? Or how should we proceed? What I will do in the next 2.5 hours or so, with the break, and I will not speak during the tea break, is to show you how it all evolved. To show you why this question took shape and form in a different fashion. To show you why the Jewish people have changed characteristics amongst themselves and in the minds and hearts of the others. And why this question of anti-Semitism continues to be part and parcel of the international discussion, and of course in variety of manners in different localities, of course. So let's begin this journey by this question of the Jewish existence. The Jewish existence, of course, was like all other ancient people. The Jews were a kingdom that was assembled out of a tribe or tribes. These tribes, in one point or another, created the kingdom, and there are lots of debates whether the Davidic and Solomon kingdom in the 10th century, how it existed or not. We're not going to get into it. It's clear that this kingdom split in the 8th century BC and almost went into oblivion, or eventually went into oblivion, with the Assyrian conquering of the people of Israel. It was known as the people of Israel. It was not known as the Jewish people yet. When the people, or the people of Israel, split into two, they split into the Judean people and the people of Israel. One people went into demise like many other nations. The other survived the kingdom, and the kingdom was identified more or less with the legacy of a city of Jerusalem, with the legacy of a single God, what we call monotheism, but different monotheism, because there were other nations, ancient nations, with one single God, Jehovah. With a legacy of a people who are trying to exist in a very troubled area, which was, of course, controlled by major powers, whether it was the Persians, the Babylonians, the Ptolemies, the Egyptians, later on the Macedonians, all the way to the Romans. And at one point in time, this tribe, national tribe, which was a nation in the old sense, because nationhood existed for all matters in antiquity. It's not an innovation of modernity. Nations existed. Ethnicity and politics were one. And when it was destroyed in 586 by the Babylonians, and they went into exile in Babylon, the Jews have recreated themselves in a variety of manners, short exile, accentuating religiosity over nationality. Religion and its boundaries, and the sanctifying of life in religious life in exile became the marker that preserved the people in the absence of political power. This was at the time of Jehoiachin, the young king. They went into exile. They were sitting on the river of Babylon, weeping for the land, but also, as Jeremiah the prophet said to them, go and prosper and build and so on. Dual kind of existence. On the one hand, enjoy exile or try to live without sovereignty. At the other hand, fearing for the lack of patrimony, fearing for the lack of land as a way of designating the people. Nothing different than other peoples. Only that this transformation of the creation of the Jewish God and the Jewish text as eternal. Most ancient people, when they lost their God and lost their state, that was finale. All if you read the Bible, Chivi, Yevusi, Prizi, you read the Bible, they all disappeared. The Jews did not disappear. They transformed themselves into a people where God controls history itself. So everything that happened to them not because others have done it to them, but rather their relations with the Almighty. This was completely revolutionary in terms of the perception of history, in terms of the perception of the Jews vis-a-vis history. They are unique in history. Their relations are not vis-a-vis other powers. Their relations are with a God who chose them and will choose them again when He is ready and when they come back to Him. This is quite remarkable. In that respect, all what is done to them because of their relation with God and not because what others do to them. That gives them tremendous power, notwithstanding the powerlessness. They are always more powerful because they have the Almighty, and He controls history and controls humanity. This will have tremendous power in terms of the legacy of anti-Semitism and the roots of others looking at them and say, who are these arrogant people in the absence of power thinking that they are the most powerful? Think about it. If they are the chosen people, notwithstanding what happened to them. Huge story. And of course, sanctifying the text. The Deuteronomy is, of course, the big story of the Jews, the discovery of the Deuteronomy. And therefore, the legacy has one day He will restore us. He will restore us. We will go back. We are part of history and we are in His hands. Which means whatever happened to us, we are coming back. This is not something that the powerful like to hear. When you hear that, you think that those powerless, worth nothing, suddenly think that they are better than you. This story will continue to follow the Jews wherever they may be in the next 2,000 years. It creates messianism in their own midst. It creates a certain degree of humor about life. It creates a certain degree of understanding that even in calamity, maybe something good will happen. It creates certain naivete. And in the era of Zionism, it creates in the minds and hearts not only naivete, but colossal failure of understanding history, because history in the Zionist mode is we take our fortune in our own hands. No longer we count on God to arrange it. We arrange it. That's modern Zionism in the state of Israel. It has to be understood. This issue is so important for understanding the origin of the legacy of the Jews among nations. This legacy will follow the Jews throughout the time of what we call the Second Temple, all the way to the time of the Maccabees, of the Hashmonai kingdom, which was the kingdom because God returned the people of Israel to Zion. The return to Zion was a major, major development. But they never returned to Zion into a sovereign nation. He retained if you read the Bible, Ezra and Nehemiah They come back as emissaries of the Persians, of Cyrus. It's not by mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that until today, when Donald Trump comes to Israel and he announces that he recognized Golan Heights and he recognized Jerusalem is Jerusalem, Netanyahu calls him Cyrus. He is Cyrus in the minds and hearts. Cyrus did that. The same saw himself Mr. Truman. When Truman recognized the state of Israel in 1948, 16 minutes after the creation of the state, he saw himself and said, I am Cyrus. I've been chosen to return the Jews to the land. This kind of like a perception of the powerful of history, or the power kind of like of history, the legacy, is still with us until today. It never goes away. It's so powerful. So the Jews, like many other people, lived religious life in Jerusalem after they were restored by the Persians. But they never lived sovereign life. They were just very small autonomous people practicing their religion in the temple in Jerusalem, sacrificing, and the big leaders are no longer kings. The Jews no longer have kings after the collapse of the first temples. What they have high priests, or they have what the people who know the Bible more and more so, the Pharisee. What happened is, the legacy is returning at the time of the Second Temple, when the Jews restore sovereignty. They restore sovereignty on the heels of the collapse of the Macedonian Empire. The Macedonian Empire, which went into oblivion after the death of Alexander the Great in 322, after in fact he was visiting Jerusalem, allowed this kind of like changes in the region in the Middle East, in which the Antiochus Epiphanes, that anyone who celebrates Hanukkah knows his name, came to deal with the Jewish people and their desire to maintain their temple, desecrating the temple. So the big question of anti-Semitism was, how can you attack our religion? Keep in mind that in the ancient world, you did not attack religious denominations. You allowed them to exist. It was part of kind of like, keep your autonomy as long as you pay homage to me. And they restored their sovereignty for about 80 years, trying to create a new legacy of power. And indeed, when they have created legacy of power, they have assembled all the people from the diaspora around the temple in Jerusalem, because the Jews dispersed after the Babylonian exile all over the Middle East and all over the world, in fact, for that matter. Running in history, what you will see, that this type of sovereignty will not last for long. It will last only until the Romans becoming too powerful and cannot stand this kind of sovereignty. Eventually the sovereignty, the Maccabee sovereignty was moved into Herod's, and in that respect it's interesting to note, the Herodian kingdom, Herod kingdom, the Jews became again a tribe and a nation, and they converted everybody. Herod the king was a convert, he was an Edomite. So the legacy of nationalism was very much part and parcel of the ancient world. But when he dies, we enter a new fray of kind of like disorder. And the Jews by that time are spreading in the Middle East, including in particular in Egypt. You have a very big community in Alexandria, for example, of over 200,000 people. We have documentation. And that's when you start to see anti-Semitism, when the Jews are trying to maintain their liege, the homage, not to Roman people, but to the temple in Jerusalem. As long as they were able to do so, while being in good relations with the Romans who enshrined them in power, that was fine. Don't forget that the last Jewish sovereign man was Agrippa II. He had tremendous relation with brothers and sisters in Rome, because he grew up with Claudius. You probably saw the TV series Annie Claudius. And when they're trying to attack Jews in Alexandria, he comes to Alexandria and he marches in Alexandria. And what they accuse him, the Jews, of not ready to display religious symbols of the Romans as opposed to religious symbols of the Jews in Jerusalem. That's when you have the first massive attacks on the Jews in Alexandria. The question was about lack of desire to submit. They do not submit. Submission became a big issue. Can they submit? The first time you see the language of what they call Mavet al Kiddush Hashem, which means death while not desecrating the name of God, retaining your loyalty to God, you're ready to die for it, was at that period of time. At that time, what we see is a great evolution because sovereignty is being debunked, the Romans are taking over, and this is also the time of the rise of Jesus. Don't forget, Jesus is emerging as a player in the land of Israel. He grew up as a Jew, raised as a Jew, and like many other Messianic Jews at the time, wanted to create a new type of desires and definitions. For him, it was against sovereignty. Therefore, he defines himself not as a Jew in the flesh. Flesh means in circumcision, but a Jew in the spirit. Jesus is a Jew in the spirit, and Paul, of course, will change Christianity altogether, and Christianity will be a universal idea. For the Jews, therefore, the very idea of Jesus and the relation with Christianity will become a major issue which will inform anti-Semitism. They will not submit to the universal version of Judaism, started with Jesus, but mostly with Paul. It will take time until this issue of anti-Semitism will rise and will become a major feature of Christianity. Because keep in mind that Christianity itself was a non-state religion. It took the Christian to take over the Holy Romans only all the way to the 4th century AD. Only then Roman became sort of superimposed as a state. They were a civic society religion, the Christians. And they were, of course, haunted by the Romans themselves. When they succeed, eventually, the Christians to take over, the Jewish question remains a very important one. Because the Jews are our old brothers. That's why we create the New Testament, the Old Testament and the New Testament. All of which is, of course, created from the old biblical text. Augustinus, the big theologian of Christianity, is the one who raised the dictum, Al tehargem, do not kill them. Why? Because they are the witness for Jesus. So all the popes, from the time of the 4th century AD to the time of Gregorius IX, are not allowing this sort of the massive killing of Jews. The Jews are debunked because they did not accept our prophet, but not kill them because they are the witnesses. And one day they will come and recognize their mistake. Interesting enough, think about it. For the Christian church, the very idea of the destruction of Jewish sovereignty meant what they called the replacement theory. We are now the inheritors of the Jews. We are the new Jews. They lost sovereignty because sovereignty was given to us. It's not sovereignty on earth, it's sovereignty on heaven. It's the world sovereignty. When Herzl, 2,000 years later, or not 1,600 years later, comes to Pius X, the Pope, and asks him to recognize modern Zionism. It was on 1904. The Pope tells him, of course we cannot recognize you. You never accepted our Savior. Your sovereignty was lost many years ago. We cannot recognize a new mode of statehood in Israel. Take into account that Pope Franciscus now comes and lay a wreath on Herzl's tomb in Jerusalem. In an act of recognition of the state of Israel, is perceived in the Council of Bishops in Washington as the most revolutionary development in Christianity since the times of Luther. Because Christians now recognize Jewish sovereignty and recognize that our big brothers are now coming back to life. Remarkable theology. But think about it. Throughout history, this type of relation between Christian and Jews was informing Jewish hatred, informing everything. The Jews were the significant other or the insignificant other, depends who was talking. Therefore, anti-Semitism was identified in the past with the Jews as the other, the significant other to Christianity. The significant other to Christianity was the most important feature of their life. There was no other but the Jews for the Christians, until, of course, the Muslims came to the fore. Until Muhammad came to the fore. And even Muhammad was coming to the fore, he wanted to submit the Jews, but in a different fashion, because he recognized certain prophets. But the dictum of Omar, after Muhammad takes over Mecca and first he retreat from Mecca to Medina in what is known as the Hijrah in Hebrew, retreat, until he takes over and he fights the tribes of the Jewish tribes in Khaybar. There is a legacy of the Jews' submission or insubmission. Then the Muslim create the idea of submission. Those people who are not accepting the prophet of Muhammad later on. And the fight between Christians and Muslims over the prophets and over control in the Middle East, the Jews are constantly intertwined. If you read Yehuda Levi, you see how the whole debate of the Kuzari and all of those, doesn't matter if you did study it or not, you see these are the two big religions. The Jews are kind of like, they're playing cards, they're not players anymore in world history. So the Jews are sort of a symptomatic to what happened in history. Symptomatic of what happened and what should happen in the fight of big religious denomination and of the chosenness that were now transformed from the Jews to the Christian to the Muslim, historically speaking. This is the evolution of the Jews as the significant kind of like players as others, the otherness. The question of otherness is very much changing in terms of history. I give you lots of history, but it's important, whatever you get out of it. Why it is important? Because it's important to see the evolution of the definition. You will be surprised that the big defenders of the Jews, defenders in terms of al-tehargem, don't kill them, as Augustinus said, until the 9th century, were all the popes. All the popes were saying, don't kill them, don't kill them. They must survive because they are the witness to Jesus. Don't kill them doesn't mean nourish them, but don't kill them. It's a quote from Psalms, which was adopted to the New Testament. This type of anti-Semitism, or the sort of like the Jewish otherness, is informing Jewish life in Christianity for lots of time, but the Jews are still prospering. Notwithstanding the calamity that befell them in the collapse of the Second Temple in 70 AD, in what happened with Bar Kokhba later on, lots of things happened to them, like all other peoples. But they managed to survive because of religion. They survived back in Babylon. That's where the big Jewish sort of like community survived until the 9th century. The geniuses there developed the Talmudic studies. The Talmud, the text that the Jews created in exile, was seminal because the text was no longer referring to sovereignty. Sovereignty was no longer important. No longer important for the Jews' sovereignty. What was important is all sorts of deeds they have to do in order to preserve themselves as a tribe. Created laws for the Jews of maintaining the community. And maintaining the Jewish community until today is a critical issue which is hugely debated in Israel because now the community is very open. Who belongs and who doesn't? We have demonstrations of Ethiopian Jews in the streets in Tel Aviv recently. How much we claim home ownership and home in the state of Israel. Russian Jews who came. Everybody can claim a home in Israel, and Israel no longer have the tribal definition of religion is very open. We have sociological conversions, as we call it. How do you maintain boundaries of statehood and boundaries of community? Loyalty to the state is a very important one. So what we are telling you a story is the story that an enmity toward the Jews changed shapes and forms. It was, to begin with, the otherness, and it was, very importantly, the otherness as the religious otherness. Religious otherness is what informing everything which is Jewish, all the way to the 16th century. Even beyond, but all the way to the 16th century. The fight, the Crusaders, everything which was done because Christians saw the Jews as dispensable. The Jews didn't have any place to stay. Anywhere they go, basically, they either convert or just die. Some of whom didn't want to die. From the time of the Romans, they didn't want to die. This is the Masada legacy of the Jews. So they all kind of commit suicide, not to submit to other religions. We will commit suicide, as if it's heroic not to commit suicide. Sanctifying in the name of God. Which, of course, the Zionists didn't like, and the Zionists basically consider as a blasphemy, as something which cannot be accepted. Let me take you, because it's noontime, too much history. The story of anti-Semitism, ladies and gentlemen, is therefore a story that shifts gears. It began as a story of religious biases, as religious denunciation, as people who did not accept Jesus, as people who are part of a different religion. Whether it is the Christians or whether it's the Muslims, this is what the Jews are. They are the significant or insignificant other. Religion was indeed the big issue of humanity. You may not remember, or you may have recalled from your learning in high school, or those of you historians understand it very well, the world wars were around religion. The 30-year war was a Christian war between Catholics and, of course, Protestants. They killed people en masse. The Jews were not part of it. But when they wanted to put an end to the Christian wars, and they asked themselves how we will organize the world in 1648, how we will organize it? They went back to the model of the Jews in the biblical times. All the architects of sovereignty in the modern era, Jean Baudin, Grotius, others in this country, all refer to this old model. The Jews were always a model, but not players. It's interesting. When they dealt with them and said, what are we doing with them? To what extent they can be part of it? You'll be surprised that in this country, around 1648, suggestions came to the fore of creating a Jewish state. Not because of love of the Jews, because the idea was England cannot have a religious minority. Every state has to have only one religious denomination, and this is the Westphalian Peace. You are this religion or that religion. Because the wars were religious wars. And the Jews, of course, were caught in between, and the legacy of the Jews as Christ killers developed in a variety of manners, and they were dispensable. And they could not own land, and they could not be part of society, and even when they were immediately pushed to the periphery whenever any ruler wanted to use them, because they never had a claim that something belongs to them. They never had a claim that this is our home. The lack of home, homelessness, became part of their legacy. It is not by mistake that this will become later on the outcry of emancipation in African Americans. The question of lack of home and whether they can call America home, as the Jews wanted to do in the 19th century also. The Golden Medina, our home. This is America will provide the home. And of course for African America, this is our home. When Donald Trump says something about go back to your home, so it's racism, of course. This is our home. You don't tell us. America was a different home. It's a home that everybody can claim it's their home. Not every state is like that. The liberal state changed this idea. So slavery, the legacy of slavery, was completely imbued with the language of suffering and the language of anti-Semitism. When African American fight in the 60s, and we'll talk about it, and some of the Jewish rabbis joining them, or others are not joining, whatever the case is, they were always there. The Jewish question is there. To what extent? Let my people go, they're all legacy. Legacies that go back all the way to the story of Egypt. It's fascinating. So either you use it or misuse it, it doesn't matter. They are representing something of that nature. The Jewish question, ladies and gentlemen, of the Christian, Muslim, religious question never left us. There are lots of places where religion is still very important, let alone, of course, among religious Jews. And that question is, but this is not the core of anti-Semitism today, perhaps among radical Islamists, perhaps among radical Christians or fundamentalists. But it's a different story. Modernity will bring the Jewish question into a totally different level. Anti-Semitism will evolve into a totally different level. No longer about belief in God or adherence to a certain sect of religion, but rather character. Who are these people? What are these people? Where do we find them? They are on the outskirts of our society. They're a minority. They're a minority who are weak, so how can suddenly they become so powerful? How can suddenly they have money if they're not supposed to have money? How can suddenly they play a role as what they call the wandering Jew and they become sort of players? Legacies and legacies and legacies. And these legacies have evolved from Christian theology, which became very pronounced in the time of Luther. Luther's sort of essay about the Jews is the most viral essay you will read ever. Because Luther was believing that with the emergence of Protestantism, all the Jews will convert. Once they refused to convert, he was deciding that it's time for them all to go, to die. And Luther's legacy became a very important legacy all the way to the Nazis, because they will not submit to conversion. But when religion was a little bit subsided, and modernity came to the fore, the big question was, who are these people who are in the outskirts of our society? Can they become part of us? What's going on here? As much as they wanted to belong, could they belong at all? Could we include them? Are they other in a permanent fashion? Are they other in a permanent fashion? Think about it. Jews wanted to be part and parcel of Germany. Patriotismus der Tat. Patriotic of the state, shedding all their identities, and still they will redefine as an erase trait. They will redefine by their attributes about money, including in Shakespeare. They will redefine by their lack of place. The lack of place means they are wandering. Of course, they are wandering, they lost sovereignty. So they are belonging to nowhere, they belong to nothing. All these legacies of modernity will be kind of related to the Jews. And many countries could not understand what to do with them. Can they be reformed? Or should they be reformed? Huge debates, theological debates. You will find in Europe history so many essays about what to do with the Jews. We use them, in fact, as people who are money laundering because they cannot hold any jobs. So they have to be on the outskirts of society. But in Christianity, money laundering is a sin against God. So you ask them to be the number one money launderers, and then you can dump on them for being money launderers. Anti-Semitism at its best. Let's assign you a role which anyone who takes such a role is a traitor. And the issue of treason, and the issue of otherness, and the issue of borderless, and dispersion are all become debunked as legacies of a threat and as legacies of a maligned race eventually. Take it fast forward, ladies and gentlemen, And this is quite fascinating. I will tell you something, you will think about it. Nowadays, when we talk about globalization, when we talk about people who are borderless and the markets are borderless and migrants should move back and forth and back and forth, suddenly everybody's cherishing the Jewish condition as a diaspora. And who do they debunk? The Israelis who sit on their land. Suddenly they say, why they sit on their land? They were designed to be diaspora people. So now let them kill them there because this is not for them to be. Quite remarkable. Anytime they changed their role and tried to adjust, their role became debunked because the role that was assigned to them in the past or the role that should be assigned to them according to the legacy that we think they deserve. Confusing, right? If you ask me to repeat this question, I will never be able to do so. But it's a true sentence. That's how it evolved. Which means that we have here a legacy of evolution that constantly challenges boundaries which are not themselves well defined. When the French issued the Emancipation Proclamation, and everybody should be a citizen, they themselves are afraid because Catholics said, wow, they're going to be equal to us? And they called to Napoleon and said, restrict them and make them a religious sect. And Napoleon issued a decree that created the consistoire. The consistoire is the Jewish sort of like rabbinical authority as a legacy of kind of like separateness. When they themselves claim belonging and desire, suspicious is becoming, wow, they want to be part of us? We're going to have a fifth column in our midst. But if they want to stay aloof and part of a separate group, there are, of course, separatists who are threatening our unity. No way out. No way out. And all of this is part and parcel of a theory that constantly is evolving. If it was in the past related to the question of God and sanctifying God, and which God is, who is chosen by God, because it was clear that the good Lord chose them in their minds, but the good Lord kind of like dropped them and chose the Christian and chose the Muslims. And how they can claim that God chose us again afresh. It's not by mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that religious Jews, Zionist religious Jews in particular, when they come to the state of Israel, the whole legacy is God have chosen us once again. It's redemptive moment. Israel is the redemptive moment. Atchalta de Geula, which means the beginning and the flowering of redemption. This is what sovereignty is all about. It's the legacy of returning, which is the most powerful theology of the religious Zionist Jews, of Rabbi Kook and his descendants, including, of course, the big rabbis of the United States, Soloveitchik, etc. Kol dodi dofek, our Lord is knocking. Look what has happened in history. He has a beautiful essay, Soloveitchik, and he said, look at this. God is knocking. Israel is being created in the early 50s. And he said, it's quite remarkable what happened to the Catholics at that moment, because this could never happen. And now when it happened, what they say? It is not by mistake, and I'll tell you a very interesting story, that the Catholic history never tells the story of the Jews regaining sovereignty in the 2nd century AD in the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba revolt was an amazing story of the Jews assembling power after the destruction of the Second Temple and defeating the Romans for 4 years. The largest defeat the Romans ever had is about these people of the Jews recreating their sovereignty for 4 years. But you will never be seen it mentioned by the Christians because according to Christian theology, they could never create sovereignty because sovereignty was lost. The rabbinic Jews also never mentioned it because for them, sovereignty was such a calamity and we should stick only to the Torah. And we don't write history. There is no Jewish history written after the destruction of the Second Temple until the 19th century. No Jewish history written. Interesting, a good lesson for you. You will not find any Jewish history written. Only theology. Because even God sits and studies the Torah. Because there is no mukdam or meuchar b'Torah. God sits and studies the Torah. Fascinating. Zionists, of course, will change all of it. We are looking forward. This is history. We recreate history. And it in and of itself create a new anti-Semitism. Let me wrap it for the first half and see what we have here. Because there's much to go. I don't know if it's a fun story, but it's an interesting story. Jewish history is never far away from other people's history. It's a history that is told and being retold in a variety of manners by other members of civilization, especially in the West, by Christians and by Muslims, by old nations and by new nations, by large segments of, I would say, of populations moving across frontiers, and by large segments of population dwelling in the lands, by the creation of kingdoms and the demise of kingdoms, the rise of empires and the fall of empires. Jews have been interjected to it as part of the story. Most of the time, sideline story. But the legacy was always there. They were the others, and these others have always signified something which is wrong with us, or something that needs to be corrected in order to bring us into a better place. This is part of the legacy of anti-Semitism. The religious aspect was critical. For the Jews, it was part and parcel of their relations with God. God is testing us. God is showing us His mercy, but He's also showing us His desire that we will be better. And He punishes us. And whenever something bad happened to us, it's part of a much larger plan. Therefore, we have to stick to our belief and our devotion to God. Maintaining not the yearning for sovereignty in an actual manner, but in a messianic manner. One day it will be good. Developing this sense that everything is happening because there is a plan. Until today, many people believe that everything has a plan, and we are not playing history, God is playing history. This is a big debate in Israel between the ultra-Orthodox and, let's put it with the modernist, secular modernists. Big issue. The religious Zionists, those who are modernist and religious, of course say, we are in fact doing the work of God as He intended it to do. Almost Hegelian stuff, kind of like, we are moving history based on what He intended us so, but we have to act. It's not passivity, it's rather activity. Passivity was the very disease that the Zionists talked about, and the very disease the Zionists blame on anti-Semitism, that we never respond. We always give the other cheek, because we create a theology of defeatists. Anti-Semitism is the disease of the Jews who are giving the other cheek and are dying in sanctifying the name of God. Only if we take our fortune in our own hands and create sovereignty, we will be able somehow to remedy this disease, and anti-Semitism, and Herzl wrote about it, will be disappearing as well, because we will be on our own, will run our life, and will not be in their midst. Zionism was supposed to bring anti-Semitism to an end, according to this theory. Because, as we have seen, anti-Semitism morphed in variety of manner. It began as a religious disease, from the point of view of the Jews, into other diseases. Social ills. The Jews were outsiders. They were the sick ones. They were the threatening ones. They were the lower race. All of the above. They were the money launderers. All of the above. All those diseases of the otherness. Anti-Semitism kind of like took them into a position when there was no real place for them. And as a result of that, time and again, they were playing cards and being knocked out. There is not even one place in Europe they were not kicked out at least one time overnight. In this country, in France, of course, the Inquisition, after they served what they call the time of the golden era of Spain, the golden era of Spain. Everybody's celebrating. I saw the gasp, was sort of like the editor of The Economist writing about the global world and talking about the golden era of Spain as the beginning of globalization. And I asked this gentleman, if this is the global era, how do you account for the overnight the Jews are being kicked out, and this is Queen Isabella is just kicking it out? If it was so good, why it's so bad in the end? Because it was always bad in the end. Even when you thought you are riding a good wave, you knew a bad wave is coming. Sovereignty of Israel comes to amend that. No more bad wave. And if bad wave, you're going to suffer even more. You're going to attack us, we're going to show you what means you're going to attack us. And suddenly, powerfulness instead of powerlessness. Therefore, when they talk about old anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism, the old one was related to the Jews as powerlessness. The new one is related to the Jews as too powerful. Very interesting. Two different legacies, which also change sort of the legacy of what do we blame? Because it suddenly relates to others as the victims. Suddenly Israelis are the perpetrators, they call them. Stealing from them the idea of victimhood. How can you be victim if you're so powerful? The new anti-Semitism. So, in the next part of my lecture, now you're going to ask questions for this part, because it's time for me to stop for the first part. Soon enough you'll need tea. How much time we have?
10 minutes.
Huh? 10 minutes. I leave 10 minutes for your questions. Is we're going to see what does it mean now, how we translate it now in the last few decades. We will see. Where are we heading from here? Is it something we still need seminars to have? Or is seminars of Charles Small or perpetuum kind of mobile, so like we need to have always anti-Semitism? It's something different. I don't want to stop your activities, God forbid. It's a good organization. Why this issue comes to the fore, why others have adopted it. When I travel to South Africa, and I come to my friends in South Africa, and South African tell me, you have to be careful, you're doing apartheid with the Palestinians. Say, how can you sell apartheid so cheap? The legacy of apartheid, which is a huge legacy. Fighting against apartheid is a huge legacy. And now you use the language so quickly about Israel as apartheid? It's ridiculous. We have a complex issue of nationalism with minority, the Arabs and Palestinians and so on. But to call us apartheid state as a way of sort of a lingua that was kind of like transformed from Mandela to Yasser Arafat, nutcakes. You're selling your legacy for cheap. How could you do that? There is a reason why it can be done, and we will explain that later. Who conquered the language of anti-Semitism? Who defined it afresh? Why this language had been appropriated? To what extent collective memory has been stolen or was taken away from the Jews and reimposed in a different reality? All of this is a fascinating issue which also relates to the lingua of the liberal state, how the liberal state is evolving, and why the issue of colonialism created a certain lingua, why Zionism suddenly was identified as an addition to colonialism, another trait, and how the old Jew becomes the new Israel. Thank you for that attention. And now 5 minutes of questions, or 7. Yes, please. Yes.
So, Zionism, in the way that I see it, the Zionist project was a post-Jew project. It was to create the Israeli and the Jewish remnant, to create the Israeli macho future.
This is your language, macho. It's survival, it's not macho. Living, nothing to do with macho. You prefer life over death. That doesn't mean machoism.
But you said earlier that Israelis are not concerned about this.
Not in the same manner the diaspora Jews are concerned about it.
But how do they see anti-Zionism then?
They see anti-Zionism as an attack on the sovereignty of Israel, oftentimes dressed with all anti-Semitic kind of like language, And they see it as something, if they, for example, the Iranians said we're going to kill you, or others said, like we're going to do this, they said as a threat to our existence. They don't apologize for their existence, and they will fight for their existence. That's what they do. And unlike the idea of saying, okay, what we're going to do, what we're going to do. The Jews in the diaspora could never fight. No work for fighting. So you either have to use the state, you have to use the protection, you have to use what we call graveling. You have to ask for defense of the feudal time, just you have to pray until the paritz will die, which means until the next king will die. So maybe the next king will die and we will be saved. In the case of Israel, no. We will not wait for you to die until we'll be saved. We're going to kill you. Very simple. If you want to kill us, we're going to kill you. Akam lehorgecha, ashkem lehorgo. This is how we call sovereign states. Sovereign states behave like that. You don't wait for someone to kill you and say, poor me, they kill me. No. You have to make a decision about your life. You are not a macho, nor you're a killer. You're irrational, defending your statehood. For good reason. You understand life. Of course, it generates new moral creation for the Jews. There is the diasporic morality and there is sovereign morality, which is a completely different story. Diasporic morality means morality without power. Morality without power has no meaning in my book, because if you don't have power, you don't have moral questions. What kind of moral questions you have if you cannot make decisions? Others have to make decisions on your part. This is a huge debate in Israel. When you have power, you have to ask yourself, how much power do I use? I don't want to abuse power. I have to be very sensitive to human rights. To what extent I can be sensitive to human rights without hurting myself? Incredible question that we're asking every day when we are raised in Israel. As a soldier, as a citizen, etc., like all other people. When America is being attacked in September 11, you don't ask for questions. You assemble the forces and you say, just bomb them. Bomb the hell out of them. They just attacked us, they almost destroy us. When America is attacked, the President of the United States drops atomic bomb. When Russia is attacked, let alone in the Middle East, which is a huge jungle, which usually people kill everybody without, it doesn't have to do with the Jews. The Syrians kill all the Syrians just for the fun of it. Just for the fun of it, as I said, without just for the fun of it. It's as rude as it is. Millions Syrians killing millions Syrians. Terrible, calamity, mayhem. Has nothing to do with the Jewish question. Now, and I will come to the second part of my lecture, when people in the Middle East suddenly realize how anti-Semitism has been abused, suddenly we sit with the Saudis, with the Egyptian, with the Jordanian, with the Qataris, with the hope of new Middle East idea, because people understand that this question of victimhood in the Middle East has been abused. Interesting development. I speak bluntly because blunt explains very well. Yeah. Other questions? I guess we had enough. Yeah. If you would like to, please.
So, a segment of ultra-Jewish orthodoxy
Yeah.
needs to say that there is some sort of an assault
Absolutely.
on history, on the world of Jewry.
Absolutely.
God.
Yes.
I fail to understand. I'm failing to understand why having moral questions, like you said, Israel has to have. How is that an assault on God from their own point?
Because in their mind, sovereignty is desecrating the religious. The commitment is to the nation and to the defense and to the freedom. Our commitment is to God. God is creating our world. It's not power. Power corrupts. Therefore, ultra-Orthodox people don't want to serve in the army. We have to study. And who will defend you? God will defend us. It's beautiful when God defends you, especially if the Israeli army defends you. Right? But there is a big question now with the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. Should we enlist them or not? They never felt so at home as in the case of Israel. Interesting enough. Ultra-Orthodox never claimed any country in the world as their own. They always regard themselves as sojourners. Only in Israel they claim home and they say it's not our home. They claim home with budgets, etc., 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 and defend us because when we pray, we defend you better. But this is changing also. They never spoke Hebrew because Hebrew is the language of nationalism. They spoke Yiddish because Hebrew is the language of religiosity. They spoke the Mamelushim, the language of the past. Up to the point that they did not even, the Chazon Ish, the big rabbi of the ultra-Orthodox, forbade them to memorize the Holocaust. Why? The Holocaust was an event, this is not history. We just want to reconstruct the old yeshivas in Eastern Europe back in Jerusalem. This is changing. They didn't even stand in the siren. I stop in a second. This is the siren on Holocaust Memorial Day or Israel. But this is changing. It's a big culture war in Israel. And because the ultra-Orthodox are growing so many in numbers, in the time of Ben Gurion, they were considered tourist attraction. Now the attraction is too big. The attraction become a danger for destruction. Thank you.